So welcome to the Global Network webinars. My name is Alexander Loschke, and I will be moderating this webinar today together with my colleague Tanya Yu. We have with us two colleagues from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR. So we have with us Andrej Kveder and Ilgi Bozdag, who will talk about forced displacement surveys. The Forced Displacement Survey is a flagship survey program of the UNHCR on living conditions of forcibly displaced people. This survey program is a global initiative designed to fill critical data gaps in national and international surveys by targeting and prioritizing forcibly displaced populations and the communities that host them to generate comparable, high-quality socioeconomic data to inform humanitarian and development programming. So this survey program helps governments bridge from humanitarian response to development programming for sustainable response, as it highlights avenues of livelihood opportunities for the forcibly displaced and the communities around them. They are mutually beneficial. The Forced Displacement Survey is a multi-topic flexible household survey for UNHCR operations hosts, governments, and other national and international stakeholders to make forcibly displaced populations visible in development and humanitarian agendas. And in this sense, this webinar will introduce the survey and will highlight innovations that support the inclusion of the forcibly displaced populations in official national statistics. And it will cover new sampling approaches, methods for data collection, and will also talk about the importance of collaboration with National Statistical Institutes to ensure reliable data on SDGs, poverty, livelihood, and other key sectors. So let me now introduce our two speakers. So we have with us Andrej, who is leading UNHCR's global survey team and is responsible for coordinating for the coordination of the design and implementation of the Forced Displacement Survey program. He's a survey methodologist with 30 years of experience in various regions. We also have with us Ilgi, who is a statistics and data analysis officer in UNHCR's global survey team, where she contributes to the methodological design, analysis, and implementation of the survey program. Ilgi is a demographer with more than 10 years of experience within the UN system. And now, before I hand over to our speakers, as usual, some practical remarks. So please write any comments and questions into the meeting chat at any time. And then during the Q&A session, we encourage you to ask the question yourself. As always, this Global Network webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Global Network of Data Officers and Statisticians on LinkedIn. So if you haven't joined the new Global Network yet, we invite you to follow the link in the chat and to join the group on LinkedIn. I will put the link in a few seconds there. And please also sign up for our newsletter. And I will also put the link for this into the meeting chat. So now over to you, Andrej. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Alexander, and welcome everyone to this webinar and for kind of giving us the opportunity to speak about the first 5 years of the Forced Displacement Survey in UNHCR. Yeah, we're going to try to be kind of as practical as possible, and we'll take you through kind of the basic design features, lessons learned, some results, and of course, kind of how we work in implementation of the Forced Displacement Survey and basically how we can potentially also collaborate with you in particular implementations. So just kind of before we get into the main topic, UNHCR's global survey team is a kind of dedicated team, and we kind of specialize in designing and delivering surveys on forcibly displaced. We have also kind of contributed a dedicated chapter in the new updated UN handbook on household surveys, particularly on that topic. And of course, we developed the FDS survey, but we also kind of support national statistical work with statistical inclusion in collaboration with the EGRI Secretariat, which is also hosted at UNHCR here in Copenhagen. So without further ado, kind of let's have a look kind of just through the outline of the presentation. I'm going to kind of present the FDS, what it is. I'm going to talk a bit about the survey content and sampling, and then I'm going to hand over to Ilgi, who's going to talk about the particular implementations and the results. And in between, we're going to also hear kind of a voice from the field to kind of share what is the experience on the other end. So in the last decade, the number of forcibly displaced has basically nearly doubled. So we're talking now with around 123 million displaced persons worldwide. Most of the data that is available for these populations is humanitarian in nature and is designed to respond in the time of crisis. However, building kind of self-reliance and particularly more durable and long-term solutions for the displaced people is usually not in the domain of this kind of survey. So there is a desperate need, there was a desperate and still is a desperate need to have more rigorous household level data focused on kind of various socioeconomic indicators and kind of trying to depict the living conditions of forcibly displaced populations, as well as the host communities that are potentially affected by their presence, and used to basically this data to be available for programming and for kind of to inform interventions. And the FDS, so the Forced Displacement Survey, is trying to fill this gap in the evidence base. Just to be kind of on the same page, we need to speak a bit about the populations that we're talking about. So we're talking about forcibly displaced population. Those are the refugees. Refugees are individuals that have been that have had to leave their habitual home of residence because of some kind of external event. This is usually explained kind of the evidence of force, conflict, and they had to cross the international border and apply for international protection. Those people we consider refugees. Of course, forcibly displaced populations also cover internally displaced people, for which the FDS is geared to also measure, although it has not been applied to. And it also captures the returning, both refugees and internally displaced people. Some samples of the returnees in terms of kind of experimental design have been also featured in the current forcibly displaced surveys. Then under the UNHCR mandate, we are also talking about the stateless people and of course the communities that host them. There is no clear definition currently on the communities around the refugees or the host communities that kind of are potentially affected by the presence of refugees. And I will talk more about kind of what this means for sampling and kind of capture and statistics that we want to portray on them. Just to give you a kind of geographic idea. So these are the low and lower middle income countries that host most of the refugees in the world. As you can see, the vast majority of them are concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. The Forced Displacement Survey was initiated in 2021 and is anchored in the 2020 to 2025 data transformation strategy for UNHCR, where a lot of kind of fundamentals for different parts of data work, including the survey work, was laid. As we have already mentioned, the key element of the Forced Displacement Survey is to serve as the transitional evidence base from emergency response to sustainable response. And basically to provide data, kind of socioeconomic data, and to try to understand inclusion and self-reliance. To date, we have implemented 4 FDS surveys. The first one was in South Sudan in 2023, and the most recent one in Zambia in 2025. FDS is a household survey and focuses on protection, inclusion, and durable solutions. It is a nationally representative sample of all the forcibly displaced, mainly focusing, particularly those 4 countries that I mentioned, focusing on refugee populations, on registered refugee populations in the hosting countries. As you have seen from the previous slide, the sample sizes are big enough to allow for the data to be subnationally disaggregated, and the sampling designs are kind of designed to kind of support these disaggregations, and these disaggregations are particularly kind of focused on the key elements that are required for programming expressed by the government or partners on the ground. It enables, one of the important things is that it enables most of the crucial SDG monitoring for forcibly displaced. It is comparative in nature, so highly standardized and with a strong emphasis on maintaining high quality of the produced data, and it's openly accessible. So all the micro data are openly accessible on our microdata sites. The survey itself is also was designed in spirit of the kind of leaving no one behind, the UN motto, and it's kind of particularly geared towards the AGD, so basically age, gender, and diversity capturing. We have different, so we gather information about the household, but also particular respondents within the household. Gender mainstreaming is an important component, but also child centricity of certain measurements. To give you a brief content, I know that this is hard to read. There's a lot to say. What we said is that the Forced Displacement Survey is multi-topic. It's trying to cover major elements of the living conditions of the refugees, from economic, social, cultural, civil, political. Particularly, we have kind of the things that were missing in most of the kind of the current existing in prior UNHCR surveys were topics around kind of more of the what is here presented in the red color on civil political aspects in trying to understand social cohesion, discrimination, integration, inclusion elements of the survey. But of course, the all important livelihoods, economic and access to services is of course present in the survey. To give you just a bit more kind of understanding of how we are thinking around measurement and what are the guiding principles, how we develop and kind of tailor the content is kind of one, let's say, impact path in trying to understand the basic needs. So we base the understanding on the legal status, which is of course for us the key element in trying to identify the populations. With improved access documentation, we can then measure access to services, facilitation of the movement, access to labor markets, and understand things like skill potential of the populations that we're studying. Similarly, if we're looking towards kind of self-reliance, like topics like like access to financial services will help us understand the accessibility of financial mechanisms such as credits and lending, in trying to facilitate the diversified livelihood strategies, and which can lead them to improved self-reliance. So this kind of logical kind of thinking were the driving kind of mechanisms around the development of the content. I have already mentioned the importance of the SDG indicators. So currently, FDS covers 9 out of the 12 priority SDG indicators that are identified and prioritized for the segregation by the displacement status. It is also very highly aligned with the recommendations of the international recommendations for refugee statistics that are being produced by EGRIS Secretariat, so the expert group on refugee, IDP, and stateless statistics. And basically, we're covering the large majority out of the 74 indicators that are featured in the standard. So this was just kind of to give you a rough kind of understanding of the topic and the content that is covered. Now, of course, kind of one of the more challenging aspects of talking about the capturing of the forcibly displaced situation is, of course, sampling. And this is also where kind of the biggest kind of step forward has been done in UNHCR from this typical humanitarian surveys that are kind of, that do not focus on the rigorous sampling as the main component, because the importance is speed and understanding of the situation on the ground. Here we're talking about really kind of statistical principles and being able to deliver credible evidence for programming and intervention purposes. So the first step in when we are trying to talk about the sampling, we need to understand identification. This is also where a lot of current methodological work is ongoing. In collaboration with EGRIS Secretariat. So EGRIS has first published the methodological paper on identification, which is now being revised. In between, there is an FDS methodological paper on the first results of identification questions, which is also available on our website. But in essence, it tells us, in absence of proof of the status in terms of documentation, how can we identify those populations that we serve? And this is basically the basic framework that is presented on this slide. I won't go into detail, but it's basically trying to devise survey questions, just a handful of survey questions that will help us identify which populations are refugees, who are not refugees, who can be other migrant groups or internally displaced or hosts. In terms of so the main challenges around sampling is, of course, that most of the refugees are hard to reach. Refugees live in different contexts. They live in organized settings, in camps and settlements. But in a lot of countries, they are basically living at large among the host population, and capturing those populations is kind of particularly hard. We are also kind of talking about the communities that host them. As I mentioned in my introduction, the definitions of the host populations are currently not standardized. So basically, we are in process, also in constant collaboration with our partners, other international organizations like UNICEF and the World Bank, but also partners in the countries, are discussing how best to identify, how best to define the host communities. Currently in the FDS, the operational definition is based on the proximity. So those that live close by concentrations of the refugees. Of course, the other challenge around refugees is the population density. They are still, despite being kind of so large populations, they are still comparatively very sparse comparison to coasts. Here are just two examples, like around 300,000 refugees live in Cameroon of 28 million population, or 1.5 million in Pakistan with almost 250 million. So they are relatively sparse, and capturing those populations is challenging. So we are exploring solutions, particularly around area-based sampling and exploring kind of ways on how to devise more efficient building of frames through listing. The one thing that needs to be mentioned, of course, you are probably all aware that UNHCR has a very well-functioning registration system where the refugees are registered. However, and this presents, at least at the first glance, kind of an ideal sampling frame for mounting the household surveys. However, there are numerous challenges around this specific use of the UNHCR registration system. Particularly, the geolocation data is not precise because of the nature of how we run our registration, and also because of the certain protection issues. Of course, because you know that we are talking about populations that are very kind of sensitive and basically in danger of refoulement and other prosecutions. And there are kind of no ready-to-use frames for hosts as we are trying to define them. So our kind of, I think, major innovation is that we started using kind of area-based frames. In particular, we are using the Google-based Open Buildings database. So for those that are not familiar, those are the this is a database that is obtained by analyzing high-resolution satellite imagery and identifying buildings on those images. And the data points are the roofs of the buildings with particular latitude and longitude, and we use those as kind of sampling points for our samples. So we have basically two different types of use. There's quite a lot of detail on this slide. I will not go into every detail, but of course, I'm happy to respond to any questions that are being followed. So we have basically geofenced methods where we define the perimeter of the camp and have a systematic sampling within the camp, or we are using kind of basically sampling in proximity to camp, where we're using it's basically gravity-based sample, where we're using the measure of proximity or distance from the camp boundary as the gravity coefficient in probability, in guiding the probability of selection. So those that are closer to camps are selected with higher probability than those that are further away. We are also kind of trying to improve the listing, because so basically the generally accepted listing methods are often not suitable for the population, just for the reasons that I mentioned at the start of the discussion around sampling, and this is sparsity. So in order to capture enough of the forcibly displaced, particularly when they live in communities at large, or even more in highly urbanized centers, classic standardized approaches to listing are not really feasible financially, as well as because of the need of resources. So there is one example where we basically did a targeted listing methodology where we use the building footprints to define the kind of our listing areas around buildings. And we list basically all of the households living within the certain perimeter. The perimeter is sensitive to density because it's based on the kind of nearest neighbor principle. So in highly dense populations, those circles will be small. In more sparse rural areas, kind of 8 or 10, depending on what kind of methodology you use, nearest buildings would be much further apart. So this kind of takes care of at least kind of the perceived and understood density of the population. And this is then this listing is then used as the kind of sampling frame for the actual selection. I'm happy to answer any kind of more particular questions around those. And now on the FDES implementation, I will hand over to Ilgi. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrej. Hi, everyone. Now, Andrej just talked about a bit more on the technical side. I will talk a bit more on the implementation, and I will share some of the results because it's always interesting to see the data itself. And I'm clicking on stuff, but okay. So in FDS, what we really also pay attention to have a very early engagement with the government to make sure that the results that we provide as their national representative, and we really care about the statistical inclusion. We want to make sure that the data it is collected goes along with the government, and particularly with national statistical offices, who has the most experience, obviously, in the countries where we implement the survey, to get their experience, to have access, and also to have a very good quality control to make sure that we have a good data that we can probably say that it's a national representative for refugees, where Andrej just talked about that it's mostly populations where it's really hard to sample and hard to get a good representative data. And so when we work with the NSOs, they can be potentially our implementing partner, which happened in Cameroon. And even if it's not the case, we tend to really close working with them. And also we pay attention to national strategies about refugees or forcibly displaced populations, and planning to make sure that the data we are collecting is actually fed into public policy, which is very important to make sure that the data is being used. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who work with data, and I think this is a very important thing to bridge. And obviously they take us through the statistical inclusion. Now, we have a colleague from the field, RFU. He's also in the call. He was our guide to all the coordination in Zambia with national offices and with the operation and with everyone. And he will talk us about the experiences from the field. If you can unmute yourself, RFU.
Sure. Hi, I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
Yes. And
Okay.
I will introduce Arfu. So he's a development senior development officer in Zambia operations. Please go off, Arfu.
Okay, thank you so much. And just briefly, so like some insight from the field. So I'm in Zambia, and from Zambia, so this FDS Forced Displacement Survey is not just an assessment. It's, honestly speaking, it's significant. So first, this FDS, Forced Displacement Survey, has already gone beyond the typical UNHCR or, humanitarian data set. The report, so for Zambia, FDS report, which will be published very shortly, but has already been formally registered as an official government of Zambia statistical report. This is significant because you can imagine, so the government cannot use or do not use like third-party data. So this is the most important part. The data should be registered as official statistics of the government. So, and the next one is, this comes at a very important moment. Timing is really good. So Zambia is currently preparing the National Development Plan. And the UNHCR is providing technical inputs to the National Development Plan preparation team led by Ministry of Finance and Planning. So, and we provided a lot of kind of technical inputs, especially socioeconomic status of refugees and their host communities based on this FDS, Forced Displacement Survey analysis. And in this context, this FDS gives operation something we have often lacked. So, we are always talking about, like advocacy, policy advocacy, whatever, but we lack something, for example, nationally recognized evidence showing where the development gaps are. Because of course, you may know, you can imagine the government, host government, their priorities always, their citizen. So non-citizen refugees categorized as non-citizens. So, we need evidence to, practically and effectively advocate with government. So, and what kind of development gaps, refugees and their host communities are facing. So this FDS gives us such evidence and data. So, and more importantly, this kind of narrative or this kind of advocacy so has also resonated with the government counterpart. honestly speaking, significantly. So somehow this FDS, for Zambia, found kind of somehow, let's say, like inconvenient fact. So if we compare, multidimensional poverty index or access to basic services, so refugees, we don't find any significant gap between refugees and the host community. But if we see if we compare the refugees host communities with the national average, so they are far behind, which means the vulnerability of refugees host communities do not arise only from legal status, but more fundamentally from broader structural development challenges, including limited economic opportunities and weak service delivery and other kind of, deprived situations. But then we do advocacy with the government. So not only for refugee-specific development is required, but for more inclusive development benefiting refugees and their host community, which is very much appreciated by the government also, and this point is included in their national development planning process. And the third one is highly relevant for, this data set or analysis, highly relevant for development actors such as World Bank. We are closely working with World Bank and IFC. IFC is part of World Bank and, kind of private sector engagement arm of World Bank and other development actors. So the FDS, Forced Displacement Survey dataset is now part of the official evidence base. So it can serve as a practical guidance for development actors to integrate refugees into their development planning process, and as well as longer term programs. So for World Bank, there is a World Bank project in this country, so $30 million investment, and which is focusing on the socioeconomic development of refugees and their host communities. So we provided, the FDS data kind of analysis, result of FDS data analysis, especially, self-reliance of refugees, how we include refugees into agricultural value chain, how we ensure, kind of coherence between refugee-related policies, and the World Bank's programming process and also government policies. So this FDS allows a much more realistic understanding of the links between poverty and livelihood, so for refugees and their host communities. So in addition, I'm still engaging in this process, but UNHCR together with WFP. So we used the FDS microdata to jointly develop a targeting methodology. So, to identify who are the vulnerable among refugees and host communities and who need humanitarian support. Or, next step, who should be targeted by UNHCR and WFP, for self-reliance, not humanitarian support, but a development type of support. So this kind of targeting is needed, and we developed jointly with WFP, so-called joint targeting methodology using FDS data. So in summary, for us, again, FDS is not just a kind of analysis or assessment. It's a very much strategic one, and it's significantly strengthening our engagement with government and development actors. So I'm going to stop here and happy to have any questions, comments after Ilgi's presentation. Over to Ilgi.
Thank you so much, Arifu, and thanks for sharing all the different aspects, how we use the data. And it's really nice for me and Andrej, we were looking at each other and we were like proudly, yes, because it's a lot of work of so many people, and it's really nice to hear that it's been useful in different sectors. So yeah, this was Arifu and some experiences from Zambia, where we collected the data last year, and the report is about to be out. So I will talk about some results that Arifu was mentioning. So we in the data set, we have so many different indicators that is available. Andrej already touched upon the SDGs and MPI and self-reliance. But just to show an example, for example, this is the multidimensional poverty index that was calculated in the Cameroon data set for refugees. And then we could actually show the poverty headcount by regions. And you can see that actually in the regions that are in the extreme north, the poverty is much higher. And then we could divide it by different sectors. And exactly this kind of information can really help to fine-tune where there is a need more assistance, how we can actually fit this into policy making and the country's planning. Another example is the data that was collected in Pakistan on education, and results were really interesting because the gender differences in Pakistan was always prevalent, and we know that obviously it exists, but just seeing it on a chart where you can see the female attendance is always so much lower compared to male attendance. And this is also another information after seeing this data and knowing that it is actually not so different among host community. As Arifu was mentioning, sometimes we assume that refugees and the host communities, there's a difference, but then sometimes there is not, because it's technically the same region, and then people tend to come really from closer regions. So this was also very useful for Pakistan operations to advocate on the girls' education. And maybe another example just to show everything overall. So we collect most priority indicators from Sustainable Development Goals, and we chose unemployment rate as an example. And for example, here you can see all 4 countries where we collected data in the last 4 years, and you can see that the results for host community and refugees, they tend to be quite similar and much higher compared to national average. And this has been quite the results that we've been getting. And I think this again goes back to what Arifu was mentioning. It's more about opportunities in the regions, and we always tend to see big differences between urban and rural areas. And I think this kind of information can really help with to see how we can improve the programming and how we can actually make projects that can improve and feed into development. So we have almost all our publications are available online. Zambia report is about to come, and we have microdata that is available for 3 countries on microdata.unhcr.org. There will be a QR code at the end of the presentation. And I think this presentation will be shared anyway, so you know which website to go and you can access all the reports and microsites and then microdata. And just to finish on the implementation, so in the last years, we gained a lot of experience, and we were thinking like, okay, what kind of points we can draw from all of these, and how to implement actually better surveys for forcibly displaced populations. And as Andrej talked through it, the sampling is always very challenging, and it requires advanced planning and testing, and some failures and keep trying, and it requires, as a result, flexibility during implementation, because as I saw one of the chat questions, indeed there are some major conflicts in the regions, and we always need to be able to adjust sampling if need be. It is much harder than collecting data compared to very countries where there's less mobility and less conflict. Coordination is the second thing that is difficult, but it's really the key to the whole process, because when you do such survey, it requires a lot of coordination with the technical people that, like us, people in the field, enumerators, government partners, other UN agencies. There's a lot of people, because we know that this data is for everyone. As a result, everyone needs to have a say and need to get involved and need to be informed more or less about the process. And it's very important to make sure that the coordination is well done, and then there is no huge gaps between people who are involved in the survey. And the third point is always about urban refugees. They are really hard to reach. It's much harder than reaching refugees that are actually in the camps, because urban refugees are very spread through the city. Sometimes they're not registered. So then it really requires innovation, and that's where it gets interesting for statisticians like us to find new ways to able to define urban refugees and to get to know about their living conditions. And lastly, identification of refugees. It is not as easy as it looks when you're in the field and actually asking people if they're refugees, and then it's a lot of different details that makes it hard. So we have the first methodological paper that we talked about, but this is an ongoing study, and I think it is very important to be able to identify refugees and also IDPs and all other forcibly displaced populations in the surveys. And just to finish, and I know that there will be Q&As, but from our side, just also we want to know what are your experiences with the inclusion of forcibly displaced people in national surveys or standalone surveys? Do you have any challenges, any success stories? Also, we would like to know if you already heard about FDS or not, or what do you think about it now that you heard about it, and also maybe about the data gaps on the forcibly displaced populations in your country or field or sector that you're working in. And lastly, maybe how do you see the contribution of FDS to these data gaps that we already walked through, but what else, what additions that you think that would be beneficial? Over from my side, I think I'll hand over to Alexander from here, and I'm just putting the QR codes in case you want to scan through it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ilgi and Andrej, for this presentation. So I have now enabled microphones and cameras, and this also means that we are opening up the floor now for questions and comments. So Ilgi has shared a few questions to you as the audience. So if you want to comment on any of these, please raise your hand and we will give you the floor. Or if you have questions, also please just raise your hand and we can take your question. Anyone wants to come in? So otherwise we can maybe take one of the questions from the chat. So there was a question by Fred Ralston. Maybe if you want to come in, please go ahead. Otherwise, I can also read it out. So what extra difficulties are faced with collecting census surveying data? This is in places where there are major conflicts going on, and when working with different conflicting groups, such as in Sudan. So maybe I can start with this one.
Yeah, sure. So yes, so this is definitely one of the major challenges. So as the FDS survey, so it is the main aim of the survey is more or less to address more protracted situations. But even the most protracted situations in the forcibly displaced context can change from day to day. And South Sudan is one particular example where we experienced this in our first ever survey implemented. At the time when we planned the survey, South Sudan was relatively calm and was looking towards it was a protracted situation. The Sudanese refugees there have been in the country for quite a long time, and the government and the development actors were looking towards more durable solutions for them to get them out of the camps and so forth. But as it happens, within the first month of our data collection, the war erupted in the neighboring Sudan. This, of course, had a major impact onto our basically on our data collection capabilities. Some of the areas of South Sudan also became unsafe, so we had to move. There was a lot of logistical challenges on how to move the teams around. But in the end, so this also meant what it meant for the actual data collection. It meant that it got extended substantially. So the data collection in South Sudan, because of those challenges, was instead of projected 3 to 4 months, lasted almost 9 months. So this is definitely one thing, but I think the good news is that the integrity of our sample based on our analysis remains very high. And this was kind of due to particular kind of this logistical solutions that we put in place and that were kind of implemented as the data collection was ongoing. And this is also kind of with the flexibility of our implementing partner and the government of South Sudan, who was kind of helping kind of understand the situation and how best to address it. Over from
Thanks, Andrej. So any further questions, please raise your hand, or if you want, you can write the question into the meeting chat. You can also comment on any of the things that Ilgi has mentioned, the questions from their side to the audience. If there is no question, then I would have maybe one question there. So Ilgi and Andrej, you were mentioning that it's particularly hard to identify forcibly displaced people in urban settings where they are just living within the host community. And you also mentioned that sometimes people who are forcibly displaced do not register. Are there any particular reasons why they don't do it, or why they might be reluctant to do it? Yeah, this would be my question.
There's multiple kind of facets to this answer. So I think I will start with what I already kind of indicated in my presentation, is that particularly our registration systems do not have a very detailed geolocation of the households that we of refugees incorporated into the data itself. The main reason basically is twofold, but kind of the main reason behind is protection of the people. So we do not want, so if there's any ill intent in the data and the data is, the registration data is fully geocoded, then basically these people can be identified and located. That's also why UNHCR as the organizations, how we run our registrations, we run them through registration centers and we do not visit people in their homes. Yeah. So this is kind of an incorporated, I would say, weakness of the registration system if you want to use it as the sampling frame. But of course, there is a necessary element of the registration system in order to protect the people that are very vulnerable. So this means that kind of locating them through our registration system is often very difficult. In camped areas, we know where the boundaries of the camps are, and we can kind of very safely conclude that anybody that is living, at least the very vast majority of the people living within the perimeters, are refugees. So identification is relatively simple. However, in the communities where they live at large, it is more challenging. In rural areas, often the organization of how people live in the rural areas, there are communities, and the community elders or leaders, either of host communities or refugee communities, are usually quite aware of where people live and who lives there. So with interaction with the basically close collaboration of the field teams with the community leaders, identification and location of the refugees is still possible, even though it's more challenging. However, this mechanism lacks in a fully urbanized city. So, for example, just to give you an idea, so we had kind of very big challenges, and even though our implementing partner, as we mentioned, in Cameroon was a National Statistical Office, we had very big challenges in identifying refugees in Yaoundé. Just to give you a number, we were looking for a population, so for a sample out of a population of 10 to 15,000 refugees in a city where 7 million people live. There are no, in some areas there are communities of the refugees, but not all refugees live in a very concentrated area. So the kind of the identification and finding those people becomes very challenging. So also just to say, just to follow up on what Ilgi has already said, there is a lot of work that is work in progress. I think we have found kind of a lot of good solutions for particularly urban and encamped areas. However, kind of for a really very good solution for our urban areas, we're still experimenting and looking, and basically this is part of the work in the upcoming forced displacement surveys, is to kind of try to further advance the knowledge and methodology on how best to capture them. Although we did the one good thing about using the registration data, at least as an accompanying element of sampling, is that we have we kind of hold the basic information on the respondents as well as non-respondents alike in the registration data. So this means that we have at our capacity, even though the response rates may be low, we have the tools to at least estimate the potential bias and possibly adjust it through imputation or kind of non-response weighting schemes, kind of being driven by kind of predictive models to kind of understand and correct this potential bias due to low response rates, yeah, which is not characteristics for general social surveys, where usually the non-respondents and the characteristics of non-respondents are completely unknown, right? So this gives us at least some kind of statistical mechanisms to correct or understand the potential errors or biases that occur in these urban contexts.
Okay, great. Thank you a lot for this great, very comprehensive answer. I see another question by Rosinia. Rosinia, do you wish to come in yourself? Otherwise, I can read out the question.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible. Good day.
Yes.
Yes, this is Rosina Diallo. I'm the data management officer with Botswana Resident Coordinator's Office. So my question was looking at your selected priority indicators for the UNHCR displacement survey. There's 9 out of 12 priority SDG indicators, and this is from 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, and 16. What I was missing was SDG 10, because the one on reduced inequalities strikes me as an important SDG for this specific movement. So we have a specific indicator that I thought from the SDG menu that we have within the UN system, we have one that actually tracks government commitments towards such, including the one that talks to the efforts, the policies that are there to protect migrants and displaced people. So I thought it would be good as something that can be used to track the commitments that are available at country level. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So one thing that we need to be clear, that we need to make clear. So the 12 priority indicators are not the ones selected by us. So they are the 12 priority indicators that have been identified as part of the SDG framework that are recommended for disaggregation by displacement status, right? So that's the 12 indicators that we're talking about. We are covering 9 out of those 12 indicators. However, we're covering considerably more SDG indicators than just 9 out of those 12. Particularly what I can answer on the 10 indicators, so basically 10.3.1 on the proportion of population reporting having been personally felt discriminated against, for example, is one that is fully covered by the FDS. So we have, in terms of the number of indicators, we cover many more SDG indicators that we have presented. However, these are these were the 9 out of the 12 that have been identified by SDG framework as the ones that are priority for disaggregation. And we're very happy to kind of share more comprehensive list of the indicators with anybody that is interested.
Great. I see then also there wasn't a similar question on SDG 5. I have 2 more questions. One is by Ibrahim. Ibrahim, if you want to come in, and I believe Pania also had a question.
Yeah, good day. Greetings to everyone. Thank you very much for the wonderful session. It's really enlightening and enriching, and I can see it's inclined towards problem solving. We really appreciate the session. My own area of concern is particularly from where I come from, that is Nigeria, though I'm currently in Seychelles for a part-time program. You know, in Nigerian setting, we have a lot of internal refugees, internal forcibly displaced person internally. And then to some extent, we also have those that went beyond the border, especially moving to neighboring countries like Niger, Cameroon, and so on, due to the incessant banditry, you know, kidnapping and restlessness in some part of the country, especially the northern part of the country. So I don't know if this current survey will also include, you know, Nigeria as a particular hotspot where there are a lot of forcibly displaced persons. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Yeah, so basically, Nigeria is definitely one country of interest for UNHCR. Currently, there is nothing planned, but at the moment, we are exploring kind of possibilities of where we could kind of mount the next countries, the next FDS surveys. We have kind of in the last year, due to the challenges that all of the UN agencies have been facing because of the reduced funding. There was a bit of a kind of a slowdown in terms of new implementations, which kind of enables us, particularly us here in UNHCR survey team, to actually capitalize on lessons learned so far and to be able to be kind of ready for the new implementations. But Nigeria is definitely a country of interest, it has been, I know that it has been discussed at certain levels. There are no concrete plans as of now, but it's definitely something that we would be interested in. And basically, if there are any particular contexts, please just kind of get in touch and we can discuss certain things kind of much more concretely. I would just like to have one more comment on the internally displaced people. So the methodology that I have presented and that we have in the Forced Displacement Survey is definitely suitable also to capture internally displaced people. So far, we haven't tackled this challenge yet, particularly because this is it has another level of challenge, because there is no known sampling frames or lists or registration lists or even detailed locations of where internally displaced people live in particular countries. Where in the countries where there are IDP camps, there is some ahead knowledge. However, in most of them, this knowledge is very kind of poor and scarce and makes the actual rigorous sampling even more difficult. Yeah. So what I'm saying is that basically I think we are geared to to do that, but it will be even more challenging than the challenges that we have already presented now for the refugee populations, but it is possible. And at least the questionnaire has been prepared with the IDPs in mind as well. So it is tailored to these populations.
Yeah, can I speak, please?
Yeah, go ahead, Ibrahim.
Okay, thank you very much, sir, for the elaboration. Actually, I think we have all it takes to conduct a proper survey in Nigeria. We have the human capacity, and we have a lot of IDPs. In fact, they keep on increasing day in, day out. We have, we have 36 states in Nigeria. So currently we have about 6 states that are so much facing this issue of forceful displacement, and that is very alarming. The locations, the various locations are no longer hidden because it has become almost a daily routine. Though from our own angle as youth, I have a small team which we call Digital Data Clinic. Is a small team of statisticians and researchers. But, conducting a national survey involves so many things, though we have the intention of scaling it up to what we call COSAS Vanguard. COSAS Vanguard, that is collection, organizing, and so on. A collection of data, organizing data, summarizing data, analyzing, and then synthesizing. That is the meaning of COSAS, C-O-S-A-S. That is our immediate task we have that we hope to accomplish. This will be an it will comprise of young researchers, statisticians across the globe, which we have so many of them in thousands that will go rigorous training. So we hope that with this kind of initiative we have, whenever you are ready to conduct such kind of survey, we have the human capacity. Since we are, we know the nooks and crannies of the country, we know we can move freely to even where you don't expect, because we even go around, we understand the local language, even if it means to go. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Can I ask you to, are you done? Because we are running slightly over time, so I just want to make sure that we can wrap up.
Okay, thank you. Let me pause here. Thank you very much.
I think point very well taken, but Alex unfortunately have some technical issues, so I'll just step in to wrap up the discussion. But before I finish, let me see if Andrej and Ilgi, you want to say anything quickly in response to what Ibrahim just said. If not, I know that we have one last question that I think is very important to take, because this is from somebody who, him or herself, is a refugee that is living in a camp. So I know that we are 5 minutes over time, but Ilgi and Andrej, if you can maybe take one last question, then we can wrap up. Abdul Rashid, I see that you are in the call and you probably can unmute and ask the questions yourself. We'll take this one last question and then we'll wrap up this webinar. Can you hear us and can you ask your question, or would you prefer me to kind of read it out?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. So I already wrote my question chat bar. Yeah, what I said, because I said that why we didn't see any impact from data survey, as you mentioned before. So it's with their great importance, and I'm asking, or I'm speaking as refugees, Sudan refugees in Chad. Thank you.
Thank you. So over to you, Andrej and Ilgi, on this question of
thank you very
real
much.
impact.
Yeah, so this is why kind of the elements that we were highlighting in the presentation are so important, and that we also heard that at least in quite some of the countries that the FDS was implemented, are actually taking place. And this is very close collaboration with the government actors and other kind of stakeholders in the country that are kind of steering the programs and interventions targeting refugees and their hosts. And their ownership of the data, and basically, and we have heard from Arefu, and this is the impact that you're talking about. Yes, it's not in Chad because there was no FDS survey in Chad at the moment yet, although Chad has always been very highly on our list, and we have we are still kind of trying to pursue the opportunities to actually have the FDS in Chad. But basically, Chad was at least also UNHCR operation in Chad was mostly now overwhelmed with the Sudanese refugees, and an undertaking like an FDS survey would be very challenging in those contexts. So basically saying that, yes, I think impact is very important, and in quite some countries that FDS was implemented, we are seeing this impact, right? So Cameroon and Zambia are definitely the prime examples where the FDS data is being used for actual kind of formulation of policies and programs that assist the people on the ground.
Thank you, Andrej. And with that, we are almost 10 minutes over, but this is such an important topic that it is totally worth the 10 extra minutes. So on behalf of the Global Network, I want to once again thank Andrej and Ilgi for taking your time to talk to us about this important topic. And as usual, as is tradition at the Global Networks, if all of you can turn on your camera and unmute yourself, I ask you that you do that and join me in just giving a big round of applause to our two speakers for today's presentation. Thank you both so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And with that, we'll finish this Global Network webinar. We have another Global Network webinar scheduled for 2 weeks from now on data visualization and data journalism by the head data journalist from the Financial Times. So I hope that you guys keep an eye out for the announcement and will join us in 2 weeks. And for now, thank you so much and see you in the next Global Network webinar. Thanks, Andrej. Thanks, Ilgi.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Bye.